There are several reasons, all growing out of one basic reason. And the one basic reason is that I feel that the war in Vietnam is clearly an unjust war. And I think there are many reasons why it is an unjust war. It is basically a civil war, and I can't see for the world of me why our nation is involved 8,000 miles away from home in what is basically a civil war. It puts us in the position of being against the self-determination of a people. And if we look back and go over the history and the development of the war in Vietnam, it is very clear that every move that we have made there is a move against the self-determination of the Vietnamese people. For instance, in 1945, after joint occupation of the French and the Vietnamese people declared themselves independent. And incidentally, they quoted our own Declaration of Independence in their document of freedom. And yet our government refused to recognize them. And for 8 bloody years, the French sought to reconquer their former colony, and we supported the French to the tune of more than $3 billion. In fact, toward the end of that war, just before the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, we were meeting more than 80% of the war costs. Then came the Geneva Accord in 1954, but we helped install a man named Diem, who engaged in some of the most repressive and brutal methods toward his own people that we've seen anywhere in modern history. And he prevented the Vietnamese people from having the call for elections in 1956. And the Viet Cong, which we today call that communist force of aggression from the North, actually came into existence as a resistance movement in the South to the brutal dictatorial methods of Mr. Diem. And if we look at the history, we see this clear pattern of being against the self-determination of the Vietnamese people. But not only that, I think this war is playing havoc with our domestic destinies. It has been estimated that we spend about $500,000 to kill every enemy soldier, while we spend only about $53 a year for every person categorized as poverty-stricken. Now, this seems to me, and I'm sure to anybody else looking at it realistically, to be a tragic order in terms of priorities. And I cannot overlook the fact that the war in Vietnam can lead us to a nuclear holocaust. It can actually lead to the annihilation of the whole human race. The more this war is escalated, the more it moves toward bringing China into the war. And it can lead to a third world war which can destroy the whole of mankind. Now, as a Negro, I must be concerned also because Negroes are dying in proportionate numbers in Vietnam. We are about 11% of the population here in America, and we are about 22 4/10% of the dying forces on the battlefields of Vietnam. Now, these things are just facts. How difficult they are to face, they are there. And this is why I feel that it is incumbent upon me, not only as a civil rights leader, but as a clergyman, as a humanitarian, and as one concerned about peace and brotherhood. And I would say something even beyond that, as one who loves America and who would like to see our nation stand as a moral example of the world. For all of these reasons, I am compelled to take a stand against this futile, bloody, and costly war in Vietnam.
Could we have the House lights, please? Do we have questions? Anybody downstairs? There's a young lady sitting here. Would you stand up, please?
Yes, Dr. King, do you feel this summer?
Well, I always hate to predict violence, predict riots, because one is always placed in the position of being accused of actually inviting riots by predicting them. But in order to be honest and in order to be a social analyst, I must say that most of the cities in our country are potential powder kegs precisely because of the intolerable conditions that exist in these cities, conditions of great poverty in the Negro community, terrible slum life, overcrowded conditions, and deep despair as a result of all of these cities. Now, Washington happens to be one of the cities with all of these problems. And Washington can explode just as any other city in our country. Now, I hope it doesn't. I happen to be firmly opposed to riots because I think they're self-defeating and socially destructive. I think they only serve to intensify the fears of the white community while relieving the guilt. So I would be the last to advocate a riot. But on the other hand, I must always speak out against the conditions which continue to exist in our society which bring riots into being. And many of these conditions are alive in Washington, D.C., as they are in all of the other major cities in our country. And for this reason, any of these cities can explode into tragic disruptions of violence.
Any more questions? Young man, right here. Yes.
Many people in the South feel that press coverage of certain incidents in the South, particularly Selma, weren't quite accurate. How do you feel about press coverage? How it was handled, especially in Selma?
Did you understand the question, Doctor?
Yes, I did, and I would say that I can't give a general answer to this because some press coverage is very biased on the wrong side, and some press coverage is very objective. I think nationally, the press merely pointed out what was actually happening in Selma, Alabama. It pointed out that the conditions were very bad where Negroes were concerned. The Negroes were denied the right to vote, and that there was a man named Jim Clark who used the most abusive and brutal methods to try to quell demonstrations as well as turn the clock of history back. Now, these things were reported just like they were, and anyone can honestly say that the press was telling an untruth when they revealed the undemocratic structure of Selma, Alabama, or when they revealed the brutality and the inhuman methods used by Jim Clark, who was the sheriff of Dallas County at that time.
More questions? Yes, over in the corner.
King, as far as I know, the communists are the enemies of the United States as it stands now until we become communists. Now, North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese are communists, and the North Koreans are communists. Now, I've heard it said that a person who refuses to answer the call of their country to fight, whether it's in Europe, in the First World War, Second World War, or in Korea, or in Vietnam, is committing an act of treason, and anyone who tells them not to serve for their country is also a traitor. Now, what would you say to that?
Well, first let me deal with the communist problem. I think we've got to face the fact that communism is a fact in the world, that millions and millions of people live under communist regimes, and we've got to face the fact that communism is a rival political system. I think it is very unfortunate that we grew up in a generation, particularly during the McCarthy era, when we were almost forced to have a kind of morbid, almost paranoid attitude toward communism. And we failed to see it as a rival political system. We came to see it as a kind of monolithic bloc that was out to take over the whole world. I think we've come to see, at least many people have come to see, that the things that we talked about a few years ago just aren't true. Communism hasn't proved to be this big monolithic block. Russian communism today is certainly different from classical communism, and we've seen changes within the communist system, and we've seen conflicts within communism itself. For instance, the conflict between Russia and China demonstrates that communism has variations. So that I think we've got to honestly face the fact that communism is a fact in the world, and we cannot continue to live with this kind of morbid fear of communism that characterized so many of the days ahead. Now, it so happens that communism is a system that I disagree with philosophically. I would not prefer to live under a communist system. I happen to feel that the great moments of history have been those moments when individuals have been left free to think and to act. And I feel that communism often stands in the way of certain First Amendment privileges that we have in America, for instance, that I just couldn't adjust to. But there are other people who are communists, and they live in communist countries, and I think this is something that they have a right to do if they want to. The other thing that is necessary for everybody to see is that many of the revolutions in the world today are animated by nationalism and not by communism. And I think this is probably true of North Vietnam. The thing that moves them on, the thing that keeps the move in the third world toward independence is more a national surge than it is a communist surge. And when people talk about communist aggression in Vietnam, they fail to realize that there isn't a single troop in Vietnam from Russia. There isn't a single troop in Vietnam from China other than as advisors. Now, if this is an attempt of communism to take over, it seems to me that Russia and China would have a lot of troops there. We are the ones that have troops 8,000 miles away, wherein they have no troops in North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese don't have any particular love for China. They were once dominated by China. And I think we've got to see that the quest is a quest for independence, for self-determination. Now, on the question of being a traitor, it depends on what one means about this. The Selective Service Act of our country guarantees one the right to be a conscientious objector. And I'm sure that all people of moral concern would support one's right to live in line with his conscience. And if one is conscientiously opposed to war, then I think everybody, including the federal government, should support that right. And fortunately, through the Selective Service Act, this is a possibility. Now, the only problem is that the Selective Service Act, as it is presently structured, only makes it possible for one to be conscientiously opposed to all wars. That is, one has to be a pacifist rather than be opposed to a particular war. And I think that part of the Selective Service Act should be revised so that one can be conscientiously opposed to a particular war. And I don't think that person is a traitor. It may well be that a person is doing this because of a deep love for his country, because of a higher patriotism, and because of a desire to see his country move down the right path of justice and to see his country be on the right side of a world revolution.
May I suggest to you read Dr. Martin Luther King's new book titled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I thank you, Dr. King, for coming in and visiting with us. Pleasure knowing you.